Hello and good evening and welcome. My name is Sarah Cochran. I'm Chief Curator here at the church. Thank you so much for spending your Friday evening with us. We are unbelievably privileged to have Dr. Daluiski with us. Thank you so, so much for being here. And obviously, Vanessa and Thomas are going to speak much more at length about your career, but I would just like to say that it's something that Vanessa and Thomas have talked about, the conversations with you since we began working on the exhibition Handmade, which is upstairs. So if you have not seen it, please, please, please do come and see the American Artists' Hands Archive. You have some wonderful examples in front of you tonight, but it is a really remarkable and unique group of castings, so please do not miss that. Obviously, we're here to talk about the hand in art, in both sort of physical manifestations and perhaps in more intellectual manifestations, as well as drawing upon the enormous knowledge that Dr. Daluiski brings with him. He is a renowned orthopedic surgeon and research scientist who draws upon expanded knowledge, contemporary knowledge of the genome and other molecular sciences to change how we deal with problems in the hand and also hand surgery. So with that, my great job is to ask you to silence your phone so that we can all concentrate. Vanessa, Thomas, thank you for coming back. It is always a joy to have you here. Dr. Daluiski, thank you, and there'll be time for questions afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah, very much. My name is Thomas Donahue. I'm the Artistic Director for the American Artists' Hand Archive, and I just want to thank you all for participating tonight. Showing the work and sharing it with people is as much a part of the archive as the objects themselves. We've come to know these things more as portraits than of just as hands. There's a story behind each one of them, and we'll have an opportunity to share some of those with you. I wanted to just talk a little bit about the archive itself. It's an ongoing project. We continually add participants to this roster of artists. Some of them very well celebrated, some of them under-celebrated, but all of them important creative people who contribute to our culture, and we celebrate them in the archive. When I was preparing for this evening, I was sort of trying to come up with some thoughts about Dr. Daluiski, and I remembered long ago hearing about how the blacksmith was considered to be almost a shaman, you know, the person in the tribe who had the capacity to take rock, to take ore, and introduce heat to it. And from the heat, they were able to extract metal. And then they were able to forge it and form it. The blacksmith was considered to be the mother of all crafts, because from that one craft, the tools were made to have other crafts happen and be possible. The idea that the arts that we're showing here are largely the visual arts, sculpture and painting. But there's so many more artists that work in sound and in taste and in movement. And then there's the arts, the healing arts. And Dr. Daluiski, what he does. In a way, what Dr. Daluiski does and what the medical profession does is that it's like what the blacksmith did for hands that are injured, hands that may have limited capacity, maybe age or material or process has impacted them. The doctor and his tradition, his art, has made those tools work and create. Many of our participants are in their 80s and 90s, still creating, still in the studio every day. So I thought it was very appropriate to have Dr. Daluiski here as one of the people who make us continue to work throughout our careers. Vanessa will speak a little bit more specifically and personally to that. But again, I wanted to thank you all for being here and for sharing this with us. And I'll turn it over to Vanessa.
Thank you, Thomas. It's so great to be here. For many, many years, I did a lot of work with Jasper Johns. I translated his original sculptures into a whole variety of alloys: aluminum, steel, stainless steel, bronze, sterling silver, my favorite. And over those many years, we spent a lot of time in his studio, and more often than not, our work days would end over a cup of tea complaining to each other about our arthritis. That's what we talk about: missing bits, hurt bits, bits that don't work, who's wearing what brace, biofreeze, who's using what, how many aspirins can you take? That was what we talked about. And over the years, as each of our arthritis got worse, I got to a point where I pretty much thought I'd hit the wall. And I didn't tell Jasper how uncomfortable and miserable I was, because I didn't. But he said, "Oh, you know, I just saw an orthopedic hand surgeon in the city, and the guy's pretty good." And I thought, well, if it's good enough for Jasper, it's good enough for me. So I made an appointment to see Dr. Daluiski at his Manhattan office. And assuming I had hit the wall, I made the common error of doing my online research, which we all know medically we should never do. And I went to his office with a very heavy heart. I was absolutely convinced, you know, form follows facility. You go to a surgeon, what do? I went there, and I went in, and I knew I'd hit that wall, and I was expecting to hear what I didn't want to hear as an artist, as a person, as a worker, as a human. We were going to cut you open, and there's going to be this long, horrific thing going on, and blah, blah, blah. But my world had gotten so small. Every time I turned around, oh, can't do that, oh, can't do this, oh, can't do that, can't do that. And I knew I needed to see him. I walked into his office, and he took his hands in mine. He examined me with his hands. And as far as the surgery, he said, "That's the last tool in the bag." And I felt this wave of relief go over me. And I don't know if you remember this, but I said, "I love you." And I was like, that's the last tool in the, and I thought, this is from a surgeon? Anyway, the years went by, and between the various braces and specialized braces and handmade braces and non-surgical treatments, he never surgeried me. And the basal joint arthritis that I had in both hands, he had said to me during one of our work sessions, a certain percentage of my patients hit a point of equilibrium or something like that, and it kind of is okay. And I really thought at the time he was just placating me. He just was telling me something to give me a little hope. But I'm one of those people that it just hit this point where I don't wear braces anymore. My hands are as strong as they need to be. There's no pain. So I'm one of those lucky ones. But I feel like he gave me my life back as an artist, as a worker. Every year or 6 months or whatever, when I'd go in, I would bring a bronze in to show him, because I knew we had this connection through Jasper. I knew he was a total art geek and a lover of art. I knew he loved artists. He loved art. He loved the makers. So every time I completed a bronze, I would put it in a bag and bring it to the city on the train. And he would examine it, and it was just a wonderful golden thread that continues to this day. He's worked on Mary Frank's hands, and I've sent friends to him, and he's just given me my life back. So I'm really proud that you're here and grateful for your work, and I'm going to let him talk to his craft.
Well, that was extremely lovely and kind, and I think that I should probably just go home now, because I'm not sure that I can top or even meet those expectations. It's wonderful to, Yeah, I'm happy to move around too. It's wonderful to come here. Liz and I have never been to Sag Harbor, or at least I haven't been to Sag Harbor. So it's a wonderful place. We didn't spend much time here, and it wasn't a too terrible drive, but it was a wonderful invite, and we're in a lovely venue, so it's very nice to come and chat with you today. I do have a couple of disclaimers, though. One is that I'm not an artist. I'm not an art critic. I'm not an art historian. I do enjoy art. I enjoy art tremendously. But I appreciate the artistic process, and I do think there are some components of medicine that truly still are medical art. I got yelled at multiple times, but I'm not going to say who. But there's a bunch of pictures in here, and they're pictures from my own personal use. I run with an iPhone, and if I see something interesting, I've taken pictures of hands for many, many years. So I apologize. Some of them I know, some of them you'll know, and I don't remember. Some of them are street art, so it's hard to kind of go back and figure out who those are. So I apologize to any of the artists, if any of you are here that have done this work. It's all amazing, and I love it, but I wish I could attribute everybody, but I can't. This is not an academic talk. We give a lot of academic talks, and it may meander sort of into academia a little bit, but I'm trying to make points here. There's a little bit of blood, so anyone's super squeamish here? No one? None of it's terrible, but I'll try to warn people. So I've had this fascination with hands for obvious reasons. It's my profession. It's what I look at all day, every day. And it's I think in any profession that you do, I notice things because that's all that I do is take a look at hands. And we'll be on the subway or on the train, and I'll notice certain pathologies of hand just because I'm used to looking at it. And it's a tremendous amount of power looking at things very, very quickly and having a pretty good sense of what's going on after seeing so many hands. Patients, all of us, myself included, you're not really aware of your hands until they hurt, and then it's forefront in your minds. But interestingly, and this is the part that sort of I still have a hard time grasping with, they're not unnoticed by artists. And I'm assuming that all these artists have not necessarily had hand injuries. So there is a creative element to this, and I think probably almost as much as the face, maybe not quite so much, but these are parts of the body that have been beautifully noticed and lovingly drawn or painted, and not necessarily photorealistically beautifully painted, but painted in a way that it gives depth and interest, and oftentimes it's the thing that holds the piece together. So I think as a natural extension of me looking at hands, I've looked at many of your hands. It sounds creepy when I say it out loud, but I do notice hands. And it's a natural extension going into an art gallery or seeing street art and seeing the hands that are in it. And let's kind of continue to promote and carry that in our 3 kids that we'll be walking in the middle of some city that we're traveling to or whatever, and someone will say, Daddy, there's a hand over here, take a picture of it. So I've been taking pictures for quite some time. And it was interestingly difficult to actually come up with a theme to talk about. We've talked about this many times over many years, and the sort of ethereal idea of hands and art is very interesting to me, but it's hard to articulate. So hopefully I'll come up with something that's cogent. So when you observe things, when you look at things, you notice them, and I think that it's just a matter of being open-minded and making sure. This is a patient of mine, 2-year-old, no injury at all. Patient's family brought them in, and what's remarkable about this young child is that she has an extra finger, which is difficult to see unless you actually are counting fingers, which most humans don't do. We see atypical fingers, atypical things, and there's a threshold. There's some people have longer fingers, but there is a threshold effect that many hands, you probably don't even notice. I have this interesting anecdote which happened two nights ago, when we were in a bar for Liz's company's holiday party, and I went downstairs to go to the restroom, and I was wearing scrubs because I almost always I almost showed up in scrubs today, and I was coming back up, and this woman stopped me and says, and we were chatting about stuff, and she asked me what I do, and after I told her I was a hand surgeon, she pulled up her hand, and she had 3 digits, a thumb and 2 fingers. And we were chatting, and just casually asked her, well, how many people notice that you have a thumb and 2 fingers? And she said, almost nobody. because the thumb and the index and middle finger, they looked that they were normal size, very functional. She gave me another story of a previous boyfriend. They dated for a year before he had noticed. I'm not sure how true it is, but that one. But right, I'll just leave that one there. But hands are everywhere, and the fact that artists go to great lengths to draw them in different ways or paint them in different ways, I find fascinating. So having sort of this curiosity that artists really know hands well, it's understandable that we sort of use our hands, but most times it's unnoticed. But this is not a new tradition, right? This is a cave from way down in Patagonia, and I didn't go. A friend of mine went into it, and inside there's petroglyphs of hands, and it's one of the first sort of petroglyphs in the Patagonian region where you can see this small hand. Clearly needed to be communicated that hands are important. So why? I mean, hands are communication devices. I mean, I don't use my hands quite enough, and I'm not Italian-American, but a lot of cultures use hands to gesture. All of us do to some degree. It's our second most important tool, our brain being the first, but it's a pretty close second, right? I mean, it's one of the things that we all use, we all sort of take for granted. And there's this human need to be able to show it. I don't even know how I came across this paper, but this is a paper, and I promise you this is the only reference or paper that we'll talk about in the study, but they looked at old, ultra-conserved languages, ancient languages, and of all the nouns in thousands of pages of text, the third most common noun was the word hand, after man, male, and mother, before fire, which I thought was kind of interesting. So clearly it was important for us to show hands, to draw hands, to talk about hands, and be able to discuss through different language. So it's used for communication. I mean, the sort of obvious use of communication is the use of American Sign Language, or any sign language for that matter, but all of us use hand gestures on a regular basis. And there's actually a whole litany of papers, there's a whole research behind use of hands in communication, and what percentage of communication actually comes from hands, and how if it's a Congress use of your hands, it helps promote. Sometimes you can actually detract from a certain message by having hand gestures that aren't necessarily in line with what you're trying to say. And there's certain things where a simple picture of a hand, now it's, I guess, a little bit misleading, shows you exactly what it's trying to say, right? And there's a lot of these. It's not just one or two. There's a lot of them. So we have all of these sort of built-in gestures that hands provide us with, including things. And you can see someone was unhappy with the candle on the left at some point in this effort. I think this was in Seoul. So there's a lot of communication that we have, both in helping us articulate with language, but also by the hands themselves. An example of clearly not the center of this particular painting, but the hands are so critical. In fact, the woman on the right is actually looking up sort of towards the hand, and it almost like it captures this ring of people, and the thing that joins them all are their hands. This is a poster that was up on the West Side Hudson Yards area before the Hudson Yards went up. And it was so I ran when I was running more frequently in the morning. I ran by this and I actually stopped because without the hand, like you almost know what is going on in this person's mind because of her hands, more so than even the photograph itself. Hands are used for everything we do. Every one of us here probably uses our hands to a significant degree, if not entirely, in our professions, in our personal lives. Artists, gardeners, of course, most of us work on computers, including myself. Construction workers, anything, and of course, what I do, all uses our hands, including artists. And this is a shout out to one of my wonderful hosts, Vanessa, and this is one of the beautiful pieces of work. And I think you actually brought I think you brought Mary's hands in at one point. And we chatted about this because the amount of detail that goes into this kind of casting, it's like you're looking, it's in some ways almost better than looking at a human hand because you can see contrast in a way. So you see every single wrinkle in the skin. You can see subtle things that are hard to see even in person. So hands also help define us as being human. And this is just an interesting picture that when we were, I think, at the Bronx Zoo, one of the patrons was showing this gorilla video. And it's because we have opposable thumbs in part, but also we have these expressions that we use that we've talked about before. And it's to some degree noticed when they're different, if you use them in a different way, if you have a hand that's kind of outside the general range of what we'd expect as normal. Not necessarily numbers of digits, but size and length of digits and other differences that are quite apparent. Here, interesting thing that we saw at the Berlin Zoo of a pseudo thumb, and this is in a panda. And notice that each of the fingers, there are 5 digits, each of the fingers is in the same plane. So instead of having 4 fingers and then this other digit that's outside the plane of the palm, it's 5 digits in a plane, and they have a pseudo thumb that acts as a hook, sort of. But this really is a substantial difference in function than what we have as humans. Sir Charles Bell, who wrote a book that I've not read the entire thing, so I will not recommend it, but it's actually available online. I think it's one of the Google texts that's been scanned that everybody has access to. An entire book on the hand, and I'll just read this because I think it's a very interesting quote that personifies the importance of our hands. We wanted to define the hand as being exclusively to man, corresponding in sensibility and motion, in that ingenuity which converts the being who is the weakest, us, in natural defense, to the ruler over animate and inanimate nature. And you can sort of argue whether this is good or bad, but it's a very interesting thing. I actually agree with it. Our hands help us define us as humans. And they tell stories. This is a close-up, not the entire screen print from Andy Warhol, and you kind of know what the story is just by not even knowing who the subject is and just seeing this gripped hand in this person. I'm going to show just a couple sets of images, all of people holding hands. And what's remarkable is that it's the same picture over and over again, and yet every single one of these, just by the hands, clear the age, will tell different stories, different couples, a grandparent and an older child, a grandparent and a younger child. And then there's very symbolic hand holding or double hands that are just showing embracing and unity. And then there's the very stylistic graphic one that gives us instructions on what we should do when we cross the street. And all these are the same, just 2 hands, but it's remarkable at how much difference in language and how much information we can get from portraying this. So when I see them, almost always they're injured or different, right? They're not necessarily painful, but most patients come in because there's significant pain and significant injury. Patients have a temporary setback. Pain, dysfunction, injury are all part of the process. And I have a fairly large component of my practice that takes care of congenital differences in kids. So I see kids that are different, and not better or worse, they're just different, and they usually adapt very well. So many of the things that are impaired when we have injured hands are the things that we just mentioned. So any kind of work activity is significantly impaired. Bimanual tasks, we sort of underestimate how important it is to have not only one hand, but 2 hands that work in concert. So, and I notice that as my eyesight is getting worse and worse, we take care of patients that don't have good elbow range of motion. And you think it's just a stiff elbow, you can kind of work around that. But if you have an elbow that can't flex in a certain way, then instantly, instead of holding a magazine or something closer or further away, your set point is based on the degree of flexion of that one elbow. So bimanual tasks are something that I think a lot of people don't really realize until you have an injury in that opposite elbow. And then communication as well. Here are 2 different patients. And it's interesting, I was trying to look for slides and pictures and videos of examples, and I would never take a video of this. These are patients I actually saw this week that were kind enough to say it's perfectly fine. Obviously won't tell you their names, but this first patient is 6 days after a distal radius fracture, and you can tell what side the fracture was on. It's on the left side. You can tell she's swollen, she has a little bit of bruising, it's kind of yellowish. And I just asked them to just try to speak as normally as possible. So they knew what I was doing and why I was doing it. But it's clear the left side, her left hand is not working well. She's not conversing. She doesn't feel comfortable. And we see that all the time. And in fact, not only do we see it all the time, there's a range of normal deficient motion or deficient use of her hand immediately after surgery. And if it's way off to one side, some patients will come in and it's wonderful. They're talking with their hands right away, and you just kind of wonder what sort of magic genetics that patient has that allows them to do that. And other patients have such a hard time, either psychologically or physically, using their hand, that they'll come in the entire conversation, even after I say it's really important to use your hand, they'll still, after we have this conversation, still sit with their hand up in the air, not moving it. Here's a second patient who's about 4 weeks out, same operation, ironically same side. Sorry for the video quality. And you can see much more. She's actually she's trying to be animated, but you can still tell it's her left side. She's going out of her way to do it. Still swollen, the fingers don't move quite so much, and they're still not quite the normal. That she sort of overemphasizes it at this point. But even her elbow, she's not supinating. She doesn't put her palm up. She's purposely trying to not do that because in this particular operation, after a distal radius fracture, that movement hurts. So I'll just give you a couple of other examples of things that I see, not that they're right or wrong, but things that I see kind of looking at art through the lens of a hand surgeon. We'll chat a little bit about this. This is an example on the left of a patient who has a condition called macrodactyly, big fingers, macro big, and dactyly is fingers. And this is a congenital condition. There is a genetic cause for many of these, but not all are known. And this is a very disfiguring condition for most patients. And in addition to being very noticeable, these digits for many patients are not very functional. So this is a condition, unlike the woman that I mentioned before with a thumb and two fingers, not very noticeable. This is very noticeable. So a lot of times we do operations, whatever we can, to get the fingers as straight and as less noticeable as possible. And here's an example of just a beautiful hand from a Picasso that I do not know the name of. But it's just absolutely gorgeous and so stylistic, and not necessarily a macrodactylous hand. But to have someone think of a hand that's that twisted and different, I think is super interesting. And it clearly conveys something that this artist wanted to get across. I think it's really important when we look at art, or for the artists that are here, when we draw hands, anything, that we sort of look at it as whether or not this is a pathologic process, which can add to the value and the messaging that the art gives, or is it something that we probably should avoid? And the one specific recent example that has come up is a movie called Witches. I have not seen it, but for those of us that take care of pediatric hand problems, it made a huge stink. And I don't know if anyone remembers this. It was about a year or two ago. It made a stink because in this particular movie, the actress, Anne Hathaway, I think is the actress, was given, it was a very famous book by Roger Dahl, I think was the name of the author, and this was her part. It was a character with a thumb and two fingers, and they were a little funky looking, and she was a witch, or she is a witch in the movie. And what was very striking was the outcry from this community of able-bodied, normal patients that have hand differences that are fully functional. And it was amazing. It sort of had its own hashtag. It was on a lot of the local news places. So it's really important that it's, I think drawing arthritic hands or painful hands, I think we have to be very careful and sensitive, understanding there's a whole bunch of people out there. Many of us have never seen or know someone personally, and it's sometimes can be very graphic and different, but it's not necessarily bad. And I think equating a witch with this hand deformity and sort of playing that up was probably, it was not the right thing to do. So I'm going to go through just a couple of the close-up hand pictures that I've taken over the years from a variety of art shows or galleries. Some of them are street art towards the end. And just interesting things that kind of popped up. And I have no idea what was going on in the mind of this artist, but when you look at it, these big, bold, red, striking lines really look very similar to the arteries, or at least it sort of evokes that. In addition, these little spiky things coming out of the tips of the fingers, there are certain things that we used to do more, we don't do them quite as much anymore, to help after rehab for patients that have had certain kind of tendon injuries. And this looks very similar to a lot of these. This is a poster for a Basquiat, I think it was a sale, because it was near Sotheby's, which is where my hospital is located, and I was walking by, and it was just so strikingly beautiful and rough, and almost like it was reaching through this poster, sort of saying hello as I was walking by, so I took a picture of it. And this wonderful anatomically incorrect surface anatomy is very similar to what we use and teach. And this is an example of surface anatomy on the right, strikingly different than Basquiat's vision for this. And then, of course, walking through old statues, broken fingers. This is quite literal. We take care of broken fingers on a regular basis, but the kids like to see broken fingers, and cracks in the elbows as well are something that we take care of on a regular basis. Clearly, the cracks are of different origins. This is an interesting one, and it does remind me of Tupac a little bit, although it was a different generation. But there is a clinical condition that we take care of called syndactyly. Syn means joined or together, and dactyl, dactylus, dact, is a digit. So these are joined fingers, and there are many different versions of joined fingers, and this is clearly not a joined finger, but it's very similar to it. One of the artists that we personally like and have a few prints at home is from Liechtenstein, and it's interesting. I've loved this print for forever, and I think it's perfectly apropos and interesting for a hand surgeon's office to have this injured hand. And then just embarrassingly, just recently, like last week, I noticed it's crushing a gun, right? And it's also very interesting and apropos for other reasons as well. So sort of an interesting kind of sidebar, and maybe that's my blind spot. I saw the injured hand and just completely ignored why the hand was being injured. This is an example. I'll show you the full painting. So a lot of my patients, especially patients that are artists, know that I enjoy art. I don't understand it. I know what I like. I don't necessarily understand everything that's out there. And this is just an absolutely lovely gift from a patient who's an artist who knew that I like Chagall. We got married up in the church of Mechanical Hills, which has these gorgeous Chagall stained glass windows. And she very lovingly painted this Chagall, and has this kind of graphic representation of a person in this painting with multiple fingers, which is another clinical condition, one that I had mentioned earlier. So polydactyly is many fingers, poly meaning many. And the congenital issues or congenital differences in hand continue to move on. These are representations of hands with very small fingers, and there are many clinical conditions that we take care of as well for kids that have small digits. Whenever I see danger on the lurks, and we take care of quite a few patients that have cut their fingers, and a lot of small kids that have crushed their fingers in door jams or window jams. And as Liz can attest to, I will run around and tell the kids not to slam doors because we do that probably 2 or 3 times a week. We'll take care of patients. This is one of them. This is seeing a knife pointed in the same direction as a finger towards a hand is alarming to me, and I even to my mother-in-law I'll say, well, you have to really watch what you cut and how you cut it, because having an injury where a knife cuts the skin is one thing, it's fixable. Having an injured flexor tendon or several flexor tendons, which is shown on the right here, is something that is devastating. It's fixable, but it requires a tremendous amount of effort and time, and it doesn't always work or not work well. So the injury on the right, you can see this is a patient who is sedated, getting ready for surgery, and you can tell that the tendons are not connected. The ring and the small fingers are normal. They have normal tension. There's a normal tension to the flexor tendons of the fingers, which if you ever see someone who's sleeping, there's a normal curvature. We call it the lie of the hand. And the 2 fingers on the left, the index finger and the middle finger, are completely straight because that tension between the muscle belly of the flexor tendons of the finger is not in continuity. So you can tell right off the bat as soon as someone walks in if they have flexor tendons that are completely cut or not because of this. And this is my probably bloodiest and guttiest image. And this is not the same patient, different patient, but an example of what a flexor tendon repair looks like. And it looks like it's something that should do really, really well. Most patients do pretty well from it. But it's a tremendous amount of time to rehab from this. It's not one of those operations that is over and done with when you leave the operating room. This is an example of a sculpture. I should have mentioned up front, if there's any questions or if I'm speaking too quickly, or if there's anything you want to pause on and go back to, please interrupt. It's a small enough group where it's nice to be able to field questions as we go. I need to get one of those Janet Jackson headphone ones. Here's a sculpture. This is taken from the Stanford campus. And the interesting thing about this particular hand, anyone notice anything different about the fingers? They're not, but they're curved, right? The ring finger looks like it's curved underneath the middle finger. And that's one of the clinical exam findings that we use to identify whether a fractured finger, fractured hand, is malpositioned enough to warrant an operation. So, and the rationale for that is that you can see the patient, and this is not a great example, but it's the only one I can find in short order. The ring finger is fractured. You can see part of my initials up on the top of the ring finger. And this caused enough malrotation in this child where the ring finger was overlapping the middle finger. And it'll heal in this position, but if you have fingers that are crossing over each other, it makes it very difficult to put gloves on to really to grip anything of substance. So that's one of the few times that we recommend surgery for finger fractures. And this is sort of the first thing that you think of when you see this sculpture on the left. And kind of taken that to the 20th degree. This is a Picasso hand, which for fractures that are untreated can look very similar to these malrotated digits that we see in the office. One more example of a syndactyly. This is a schematic representation of a syndactyly on the right, followed by another clinical example. And it's interesting to me, and I don't know enough artists that have an interest in defining and drawing pictures depicting hands. But what the artist was thinking when they drew this hand, was it truly something, was it subconscious, they just sort of drew it because it was an afterthought, or was there some sort of meaning that was connected to the picture? And then there are many other things that we end up talking about as a family and we end up taking pictures of, and that's any kind of armor, anything that's interesting that goes above the elbow or the hand. And especially interesting are the very old depictions of upper extremities. And I actually chatted with some curator of the Met a long time ago now, just to see if there's is there an interesting question in the representation of elbows and how much elbows show flexion or extension in these old Egyptian hieroglyphs, and there wasn't really any interest, nor was there an interesting enough question to look at. But whenever I walk by and I see, you wonder, like, are they long digits, and like, why is the elbow so much more closer to the shoulder on the person's right, on our left elbows compared to the left? And sometimes the anatomic representation is wrong, and I feel this is sacrilegious to bring probably one of the most beautiful statues ever up. But I was looking at this when we were there last time, and like right there, there are two extensor tendons, the index finger and middle finger, that have it looks like a connection to me. And there is no variation that I know of, and it could be that I'm sure it's been described before, but this is not a common variation. We see a lot of hands, and this doesn't really exist. So even artists get it wrong sometimes, even geniuses. So back to the world, my day job, the world that I live in, we routinely will take function over form, and this is a child that has an odd congenital hand. It's a version of a cleft hand, and it's very graphically different. This is a hand that if you see it, you would notice it right away. And this child has no functional deficit. Writes with that. She is right-handed. In this particular case, we can't make this any better. So we do prefer or preferentially treat function over form most of the time. But a lot of the things that we do, this is an example of the exact opposite, where there's no functional deficit, but it's a really noticeable difference. Having two thumbs is not what humans are typically born with. So this is an operation to essentially do the most aesthetically pleasing job as we can to get this child to look a little bit more less noticeable. I think that there's a set of challenging patients, and this is one where this particular difference is called, one of our hand surgery colleagues who's since passed, who was a specialist in this specific area, called it a functional triumph but a social disaster, because this is so graphically different. It's so different than what we're used to, and we're so defined by how our hands look that this is really something that is very difficult for a child to go through. The problem is that closing this cleft, which is the operation, it's very easy to overclose it, in which case you take a child who has tremendous function. You can argue even more because the span between this child's thumb and their ring finger, whatever that other digit is very good, and it's a very functioning hand. So we do want to close the cleft to improve the overall appearance, but still make sure there's enough space to actually have good function. And it's I wish I could say that I get it right every single time, and I can't. But I think this makes it a little bit more a little less noticeable. Another example of a cleft hand that is quite noticeable. And in this particular child, there's a lot more work that goes into it than you think, and part of it is because the space between the thumb and the adjacent finger, the index finger, it needs to be opened up in the same way that the cleft between the two larger digits needs to be closed down. So it's actually a lot more work than just sort of making a cut and closing an area. This is an example of the pre and post-op visits. So this is like we're well past the midpoint, and we'll take a little bit of a break, 2-second break, well, not a real break, but and ask, what's the relevance of showing a picture of Mickey Mouse? What's that? Yeah, I see it, right? Which is surprising because a lot of people don't know that. And we use this example routinely when families come in distraught that their kids have less than normal or different looking hands. And it's one of those things that we sort of know and love, and a lot of characters do. So in this particular case, one of the differences between this child's hand, which is a child with radial aplasia, radial dysplasia, which means the radius side or the thumb side is less developed or undeveloped. And it could be just the thumb, it could be the radius bone, which is one of the bones of the forearm, or it could be a combination of both. But they have 4 fingers, right? 4 fingers and absolutely no thumb. Similar to having a 5-fingered panda, all in the same plane. So this really separates us from many other mammals having this opposable thumb. So it's very different than a 4-fingered Mickey hand, which has really 3 fingers and a thumb. So even though still the same number of digits, actually the orientation of that thumb prehensile, we call it a prehensile digit, is actually very important. So one of probably my favorite operations to do, it's called a pollicization. Pollix is the thumb. Pollicization is where we take a digit, in this particular case, usually it's the index finger, and we shorten it and rotate it and do transfers of certain tendons to restore or essentially rebuild the thumb. We convert the index finger into a thumb. And it doesn't look perfect, but it's significantly improves function to have this thumb that is now out of the plane of the palm, and it also helps aesthetically. So I think there are some operations, and maybe that's the reason that we enjoy doing this so much. It actually converts this to a hand that looks much more normal and functions as quite close to a normal hand.
Is that done in one step?
One step, yeah. And so we have 3 kids. We live in New York City, and I used to run a lot more. I run less now, but I have to get back into it. And even just walking around the city, New York City is a perfect spot for spotting hands. There's hands everywhere, and there's a couple street art pictures, and I'm always drawn to them. I always take pictures of them, and these are. I actually looked at the artist's name because it's right on one of the bridges that goes over towards Hudson Yards, right on 34th Street, but now I've forgotten the artist's name. Steampunk art, there's just all sorts of interesting hands all over the city that kind of crop up if you're looking for them. So I'm not the only person who enjoys art in hand. This is an interesting story. A patient of mine my only patient that I know of, who is a legitimate hand model. So there's always that old Seinfeld episode of him being a hand model. It was interesting that as a hand surgeon, I've only taken care of one legitimate hand model. And he had just mentioned, oh my gosh, and I was invited him here, and they said, we're giving this talk if you're in the area. He's not in the area. And he goes, wow, there's a friend of mine who has this very large collection of hands. He collects pictures, sculpture of hands. And he came out with a book recently. And I think he reached out to Mr. Buell and just said, hey, we're having this thing, and clearly he's not here. So, but it's not just me, but this was quite an excessive collection, and apparently they published a book on it that is quite nice. And then I feel terrible for all of you, but you'll suffer through just a little bit of my kids' art. As I mentioned before, my kids know that hands are a theme in the family, and I've gotten the sort of typical Thanksgiving turkey hand, and then Madeline's hand, and this is Liam's hand on the left, and all of them sort of embellished. And one on the right is after I somehow cut my thumb or got my thumb stuck in, it must be a dress or drawer. She outlined the story there for us. This is a picture of Madeline's hand, and she went into great detail to make the actual frame for it as well, which I thought was really cute. It's interesting that a lot of our patients, including and especially the kids, are very thankful and moved by the experience. And sometimes I'll get little patients, our young patients, that we see them not very frequently, but we see them back, and they just sort of like it resonates with them. So we get these wonderful pictures sometimes. Thank you for fixing my finger. I get performance artists who, these are two young women. I fixed their hand fractures different times, and they both do these crazy, like circus-like handstand type things. And they posted this on Instagram, and was a wonderful kind of kudos to it. And other patients who are just enamored by the hardware that's now in their new body parts. And this patient drew essentially the X-ray on the back of his splint so that he can show his friends what he had done. And other patients choose art that isn't anything relative to what I was doing, but this one was interesting because I don't even know what it was. This piece of metal in this patient's like tattooed onto the forearm looks very similar to one of the components of a total elbow replacement that we would put into the ulna. So it was sort of interesting that it was kind of near the ulna. It looked like he was drawn to help us direct a total elbow replacement. This patient did not have a total elbow replacement though. And then some patients are profoundly impacted by the injury. And this is a young woman who had a bad fracture of one of the carpal bones. And after she healed and she went to some either design school or art school, has this series of art. She actually got copies of her x-rays and then painted this over it. And this is her progression to healing. And she came back after she had finished healing and said, this is what I was going through, and it was easier for me to draw this than it is to explain it. And this is the last one where it shows that she's healed and it's better than it was before, and all these kind of things, which I thought was very interesting because it's for someone to kind of share what they're going through and do it in this sort of manner was something that I had not seen before. And this is that seven-fingered hand that I showed before, just beautiful detail, and patients that were sort of thankful that we both chatted about art and were able to take care of it at the same time. And this is just a couple, I see hands everywhere, and this was some art show that we went to in the Lower East Side, and it was a collection of these handprints, and then there were people talking right in front, and they were discussing this art, and this beautiful shadow of this person's hand describing the art was popped up. So I was the creepy person taking pictures of the shadow of the hand with the handprints on there. And of course, pictures of my kids' hands for certain activities. And this was a wonderful windy day in Berlin where I saw this leaf that's sort of jumping all over the place, and Madeline had to go in there and touch it and photobomb it. So I thought it was kind of a nice addition to it. And one last one, I got yelled at on the way over for only having Madeline's hands in there, but I do have hands of other kids as well. And sometimes you'll see hands in unexpected places. There are, and if they sort of peek out in certain ways, it really makes it kind of an interesting dynamic expression of I don't know, almost angst. And this is an example from a run from probably years ago now, where the little twig bunch on the upper right just looked just like a hand. I actually stopped and took a picture of it because it looked like a snowman's hand or something coming out of the snow. And this is another shout out to Vanessa. Hands are, and especially the artistic representation of hands, are very important in our family. This is Liam's special souvenir from when we went to I think, a carnival or state fair in Los Angeles, and he really wanted to get a wax mold of his hand. That, of course, is somewhere packed in boxes, but he loved the experience, and I think it's still a nice thing to have. And due to the Christmas season, these are ornaments on our tree. Our puppy dogs, and we all have hands, and Liz got this wonderful skeleton hand that's on our tree, or will be on our tree soon. And then the upper one in the middle is actually my hand when I was 5 that somehow my mom kept and sent to us. Yeah, so the kids are. So we do have a small art collection. It's not this. And a lot of stuff, this is probably my favorite print. And this is from the Anatomy series from Basquiat. And it's just such an absolutely wonderful depiction of anatomy, and it's so wrong and so off and so beautiful all at the same time. But it really is. I mean, it's interesting, and to have an artist that was clearly haunted by anatomy, not just the upper extremity, but really anatomy in a way that I think a lot of artists aren't, is very nice. And this is an example to the right of the real anatomic parts and anatomically correct position. This is a print from Liechtenstein that we don't have, that I have been wanting to get for a long time. And this shows many different things in the hand surgery world, including the pulsization that we talked about. On the upper left, star hand, there are clinical conditions that make digits very kind of thin and pointy. A not so different hand in the bottom right, and then a hand that's very stiff on the left. It's stiff as a board. And it's just kind of a nice representation. This is one of those prints that at some point we'll hang up in my office, and we'll be able to chat about it with patients that come in. That's all that I have, and I'm not going to, well, I will read this because I think it's a very interesting amalgamation of both science and medicine. The worst man, woman, person of science is he who is never an artist, and the worst artist is he who is never a man of science. In early times, medicine was an art, which took its place at the side of poetry and painting, and today they try to make it a science of it, placing it beside mathematics, astronomy, and physics. Just a nice reminder that we need to be both, right? And it's nice to be both. So thank you both. I'm happy to answer any questions, but.
This is kind of a two-part question. You showed I think it was a gorilla?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so we separated from them 6-7 million years ago, right? And basically been Homo sapien for 100,000 years or something. And I think it was Homo habilis who we descended from immediately.
I trust you, but yeah.
No,
Yeah.
okay then.
Sorry.
But you're supposed to know this. I need an answer. What was, from our immediate ancestor, what evolutionary change was there in the hands? Do you know that?
Unfortunately, I do. So it depends on who you believe. I have a partner who strongly believes that the specific motion of the mid-carpal portion of the wrist was one of the defining features that drove us into having a current modern-day hand. And it's a motion that just isn't flexion or extension, but it actually goes from wrist extension and radial deviation to wrist flexion and ulnar deviation. And that mechanism, that it's not, we measure extension, flexion, and ulnar deviation, radial deviation, but that's not how humans do. Humans work, and he calls it the dart thrower's motion, because imagine if you're throwing a dart, that's the motion that has led to increased in tool. This is, obviously these are hypotheses.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Part two of the question is, so we went from hunter-gatherers to agriculturists to mechanists. Has there been an evolution of the hand in that period of time?
I think it's too short. I actually don't know. I mean, it's a good
No, I'm
question,
just
but I don't
wondering,
think so.
just curious.
Yeah, no, I
I
don't
mean,
think so.
because so much changed about, or the hand at a certain point could just do anything.
I mean, well, obviously evolution is always taking place.
Yeah.
I'll answer a different question that may gloss on it a little bit. When I look at hand x-rays, there's tremendous variation. So if I showed you 10 different hand x-rays, not that it's rocket science, but it's hard to see the differences. But once you see them, it's hard to unsee them. There are differences in how the capitate looks and how the hamate looks. So there's clearly, every time that we have a new child being born, there's different pressures put on there. There's like these different little variations. I don't think there's been any significant pressure to select for those specific variations.
So last question. Could a baby born 100,000 years ago, when we first became Homo sapien, put into a modern school, do anything that we can now do with our hands?
Oh, I think so.
No, us,
Yeah, it's only been 100,000 years, yeah.
Yeah, so it's been pretty established as a working thing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Am I understanding that you're saying that this gesture is more human, more of a kind of a human thing than this kind of flexion?
Yeah, it's more functional, and it's one of the main, if you look at the anatomy of the bones, and it's not, it's how the bones of the carpus, the 8 bones of the carpus actually interact together. So it provides for a grip that allows for hammering and throwing in a way that other wrist carpal bones didn't before.
This is more like a paw movement too, that it's not
Yeah, exactly,
this.
yeah, yep.
But it's interesting, I was wondering that you didn't show the famous, Michelangelo's famous
You're a plant. No.
Adam and God, but that's actually both. Now I was just thinking, if I'm remembering this right, Adam and God both have that gesture. It is very specifically not this, and it's very specifically that.
Yeah.
So that's kind of interesting that he chose that.
Yeah, on the drive
I
over, Liz said, "Why don't you have the picture?" And I said, "Because it's so."
Obvious.
Yeah, I mean, but it's gorgeous, right? And and it says so much, and so. But I figured everyone sort of knows what it looks. So
Well, now you could throw it in if you wanted to make that example about
she
that.
told me just put it in the back, and if you need to, you could pop it up. She literally said that about 2 hours ago. I said, no one's going to ask that. Everything.
This is really fascinating. I had one other question. Do many children and/or their parents choose to, like when you give them the function versus form or aesthetic option, do many people choose the functionality rather than looking like everybody else or looking more like everybody else? Or
So it's a hard question. It's complicated, and it's driven in large part by society, social norms. I was in a talk in Hong Kong a couple of years ago with a friend who's also American, and a Japanese group who we know quite well was giving their talk on how to build thumbs. And they showed a bunch of examples, similar to the 4-fingered hand patient I showed before, that in America we would do a pulsization. In fact, I think it's criminal not to do a pulsization. In Japanese culture, it's very important to have 5 digits. It can look bad, it doesn't have to function very well, but 5 digits. And I'm not sure if it's a numbers thing or what the cultural relevance is, but they will take a small nubbin of bone and do various things that we can all do to lengthen it and do grafts from other parts of the body to have a thumb that doesn't function very well, doesn't look very good, but they have 5 digits. So the short answer is it's very personal, and I think it depends a lot on where the families are. We would encourage, we try to get both, right? We try to get as much function back as possible without diminishing and, if possible, improving the aesthetics of it as well, because I think both are important.
And I'm sorry, I have so many questions. I found this so fascinating. And was there something in your life that inspired you to focus on hands? If I may ask a personal question?
Oh yeah, no, sure. It's one of my mentors in orthopedic surgery, Roy Meals, who has written a couple of very interesting lay press books, if you're ever interested. Meals is the last name. And he was an orthopedic surgeon who sort of was a mentor. And having him spending time in his office and listening to this really thoughtful person who was able to kind of like curiously answer a bunch of different questions, and I think was just constantly challenging us to think. Like he had a bag of carpal bones, 2 of them actually, and one had a complement of normal carpal bones, and the other one had none, and we had to hold them at our hand, not look at them, and just by feel say, okay, which one has the normal complement of carpal bones and which one is missing one. And by the way, which one is missing. So we had to actually know. And he had dozens of these. We had anatomy jeopardy. So he has a lot of very interesting ways of teaching and learning, but also is an extremely curious individual. So we hit it off. I think just personally, I still am in touch with him today.
This goes to an issue I think you brought up about science, medicine, healing. This is a very personal question for me, having had a lot of time with an orthopedic surgeon. When you make a choice with your patient, how much do you feel comfortable projecting the healing process? Because you pointed out how here is one person 4 weeks later can do so much more. What is that fine line of saying to someone, 2 years from now you'll be fine? How do you decide that?
I try never to decide that because it's so different. But we give framework, and I'm getting better at being able to describe options for patients. Right. And we can't really predict the future very well. And I don't mean that flippantly. I know it sounds flippant. But we usually will know which option is better for patients. So I usually frame it in that manner. And then if things come up, we'll do whatever we can to minimize that healing time. But it's really hard to predict healing time. There are some operations that we do that are perfect, like literally perfect. The X-rays look beautiful. It took a very short period of time. The incision's gorgeous. Like even the process of doing this operation was elegant. Like it was just, and those patients, some of them have a terrible result because there's all sorts of things. We're the carpenters and we put things back together again, but the body's a very complicated thing, right? And if you imagine if you had a patient who, I had a patient and I don't know, 20-something, 30-something year old, really large man who liked to work out, and I said, you can't lift weights for 6 weeks. You just can't do it. And he came back in. I fixed a metacarpal fracture, and the whole thing fell apart. And I said, "What'd you do?" He goes, "I promise I didn't lift weights, doc. I promise." And he goes, "The only thing I did, I just moved the dumbbell to the corner so that I could lift weights on the other side." So we can't control what patients do. So there's a lot of things that come into play. There are certain operations that we have a better sense on how long it'll take than others. And the more complicated it is, the more challenging it is to guesstimate for patients.
And my follow-up question to that, do you find today with the technological advances, is there more robotic in the surgical suite with you?
No, I think, and this is a dig at my other orthopedic colleagues, and hopefully this is not seen by, not a dig, but there are certain operations that are very, very reproducible. Like, for example, not that they're not challenging in their own way, but total knee replacement is a very methodical operation. You make a straight incision, you move the patella back, you cut, and there's nuance to it, so I'm not minimizing it, but what I do is so different, a robot can't be helpful. Maybe at some point, for things that are a little bit more constrained, like total knee replacement, it can be very helpful, right? Because you can get much more precise cuts knowing where the tibia is. But we have so many different bones and things that we do. Like today, for example, I did a few operations. I did a tendon repair, a nerve repair. The nerve was about 1 millimeter in diameter, so we used a microscope. And then we had a simple removal of hardware and a couple other smaller cases, a trigger finger release. So having such a wide variety of things that we operate on, robots aren't helpful, but technology is. It's just not in the robotic space yet.
Any more questions? I'll get to Lynn, I'll get to you afterwards.
To follow up on this robotic question, do you find, or are you seeing yet, the reliance on virtual computer technology as a lifestyle changing the talent pool that comes into hand surgery and the tactile process that you're referring to that is refined in a way where you were trained in your own education, but also in your own practices, daily living, relying on computers and other things that don't have the practical arts, the mechanical arts that would sensitize those fingertips?
Those specifically are trainees that are coming in, the newer generation of folks? Yeah, we see it. And there have actually been a couple of studies that have looked at, not in the hand surgery world, but in the sports medicine literature, where young trainees that come in that played a lot of video games had better triangulation when they did arthroscopy. And that's because you're using your hands in a different way, and you can actually predict where this thing is, where your avatar is going to be, whatever, because they're so used to doing this all day. So I have yet to tell our oldest that, who likes playing video games, because then that'll be used as an excuse to be a better orthopedic surgeon when he wants to grow up. But yeah, we absolutely see that, and a lot of our residents read articles on their phones, which I still can't wrap my head around. I mean, a Kindle maybe, but like a tiny little phone. So there are definite differences.
Would you call that an evolutionary change?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the evolution is it's a very specific definition, and there has to be some structural physical change, and that doesn't take place quickly, right? Because the genes need to be mutated, and that mutation needs to be adopted, and there needs to be some sort of procreation difference. It's hard to see genetic differences right now, right? Because we have diseases that were lethal 50 years ago, and those patients are now procreating, right? And they're having kids. So it's so maybe it's happening a little quicker than we think, but not in the same way.
Hands and feet. The foot has more bones or more parts than the hand. The hand is notoriously difficult, though, to represent in art, painting or drawing accurately. And I haven't heard that people consider rendering the foot as difficult as hands. I was interested to see the types of hands that you put up as examples, but to do it accurately.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think
challenge.
it goes back to the fact that we see hands. We don't see feet, right? Nobody has open toes. No, I mean, we kind of see it, and I think we're all used to seeing a range of. Normal is the wrong word. We're discouraged from using, but a range of what is typical for most humans. When you see them a little bit off, and I should have put some examples of that, there are thresholds, right? If a finger is a little bit too long, if one finger is longer, it's easy to see. Syndactyly is easy to see. Sometimes there's syndactyly, it's so mild that there's webbing and you can see it, but it's kind of hard to see. So I think that there's a combination of things that make it so that you know when it's not right. And I think that probably is one of the reasons why hands are so hard to draw, right? Because unless you draw them in a way that we're used to seeing as humans, it's gonna look funny, right? And it's gonna be very noticeable.
Oh, sorry.
Oh no! I was gonna say what's interesting to me is that artists represent these hands in very different ways, and we're okay seeing them in art in a lot of things. And it's interesting to me, again, curiously, what they mean by this representation. Like, is it like when if in that one there's one picture where there's a big swollen thumb? I don't think that it meant that there was arthritis in the thumb. I mean, maybe they did. I don't know if they thought that much, or if it's just one of those things that just sort of came out in the moment when they're painting these.
Is it hard? Why is it so hard? I guess because we use our feet, we stand on our feet. That makes it hard because I've injured both areas. And the hand, I'm in the midst of something now, and that seems to be taking an awfully long time to heal.
Yeah, it is very interesting, and even on Fridays I operate with a colleague of mine who's a foot and ankle surgeon, who's also a very close friend of mine. And even though we're trained in orthopedic surgery, the skill set is very, very different. And I'll show a wrist fracture, and I'll say, well, I would do it like this, and it's amazing how, like, if you don't do that one specialty or subspecialty on a regular basis, you sort of lose it. But we have very good-natured banter. And not to be too crass, but we, as a hand surgery community, we always tell the foot and ankle folks their surgery is hard, but their bailout operation is an amputation. We could never do that. I know. It sounds crass when I say it out loud.
Any other questions? One more question? Oh, sorry, two more questions. We'll go here and then.
Sorry, one comment and then one question. My comment, I work as a physiotherapist here in Sag Harbor, and I help hopefully put some of these patients back together again when they have accidents and need to get back to their artwork. And I'm forever grateful to be able to help them. But I notice, my comment is that you're very, very sensitive as a surgeon and very different as a hand surgeon, and it stands out. So kudos to you for your growth. Not just in your terminology for use of the difference of form and function and how different people are, but in how you express it with your observation about art and connecting the art and the artist and the hands together. It's quite unique. So we love to have you here expressing that. And my question is, what is your favorite depiction of hands in the art world?
I think like anything that's abstract that shows, like there's, I was trying to look for a picture. We don't have any Matisse etchings, but we love Matisse stuff. And there are, some of his work is just, it's literally like 3 or 4 lines that makes a hand, sometimes 2 or 3. And you could see the entire hand with these beautiful, subtle, like little arcs. And I think that anything that's sort of very abstract, that shows exactly what we know a hand is without actually drawing a hand, I think is probably the most interesting.
Hi, thank you for coming tonight. I have a question. Can you tell handedness of someone without knowing their handedness? Are there other attributes, physical, or like if someone just puts, really?
Yeah, so it's hard to tell. I mean, there's a difference in volume, there's a difference in, so I can't, there are certain things that we can tell, like if I walk back and forth from my office area to the patient area, sometimes you can see localized swelling in certain areas and you know what the diagnosis is. Or, and sometimes you can tell just based on obviously if they're writing their name, it's a pretty easy way to tell. But that's been studied before, and it's a very interesting connection between the brain and handedness.
Does it show up physically though? I mean,
Yeah.
So if you didn't know anything about seeing them write or anything like that as a hand surgeon, can you ascertain handedness? No. It can be ascertained, but with stuff that not that we can visibly see. Not to get too deep, and we have played a little bit with using large volumes of data and X-ray to look at handedness. And it's possible to do it. We haven't built any algorithms that can do it because it's like a sort of a novelty and not really a medically relevant thing. But there's definitely differences that you can see. And I'm sure we can do the same if we took a picture of your hand and we did it with enough patients. I'm sure we could tell handedness just by looking at it. But I don't think it's very valuable.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
Ambidextrous. I've had a friend once who could exactly with their left hand go this way. I had a friend once who could exactly with their left hand go this way. At the same time she went with the right hand, it looked like a mirror image.
Yeah.
Is that common? Is ambidextrous, true ambidextrous like that common in people?
Well, so I only have what patients report, self-reported hand usage. Like, and being ambidextrous is very uncommon in itself, and I'm sure there are different varieties of it. But it's surprising that I think some of it, a fair amount of it is learned, right? I had a kid just actually a couple of days ago who I did an operation on his thumb, young kid, 15 or 16. And for whatever reason, instead of using his hand to write, which I encourage them to do because he's in a splint, he learned how to write with his left hand. I said, how'd you, like in 6 weeks, he feel pretty comfortable. So I think there's a component that's learned, but just in tallying the patients that I see, a very small percentage say that they're ambidextrous.
Any more questions? Dr. Daluiski, thank you so much.
We'd like to invite you to come up. We have curatorial gloves with all the bronzes here. You're welcome to come, lift the bronzes up, inspect them, take a look at it. There's 2 pieces up there. One is too heavy and one is too dangerous. Vanessa always says art can make you cry, but it shouldn't make you bleed. There's one sculpture over there where a knife is being held. That one we'd ask you not to touch, but please come up and you can experience the archives, and thank you so much again for being here.
Usually when we go to art exhibits, the big poster says, "Don't touch the art." Please, come touch the art. Put on the gloves and do your thing and enjoy. It's a really unique opportunity. And you might recognize a few names, but they're all so fascinating.